Plutarch wrote that before anyone thought to ask, before neuroscience existed as a word, before anyone understood what cognition even meant, he was describing something he could feel but couldn't name. We tend to think of human intelligence as something fixed, given, ancient. But the way we think, not what we think, but how, has changed dramatically, and not once, several times. The history of the human mind is not a straight line. It is a series of ruptures. Cognitive evolution is not the same as biological evolution that operates over hundreds of thousands of years, slow, molecular, invisible. What we're talking about is something faster, cultural, structural, a rewiring that happens not in DNA, but in the tools a civilization uses to think. The anthropologist Merlin Donald called it external symbolic storage, the idea that the mind doesn't evolve only inside the skull. It evolves by attaching itself to objects outside the skull. Cave walls, clay tablets, alphabets, printing presses, databases. Each time humans invented a new way to store thought, the thinking itself changed, not the content of thought, the architecture. William James, in 1890, wrote that attention is not a passive faculty. It is a trained capacity, and what trains it is the environment the mind inhabits. The environment of thought in the 5th century BC was not the same as in the 16th century AD, and neither is the same as today. The capacity gained is visible. The capacity loss is usually only noticed generations later, when the old skill has become rare enough to seem exotic. The environment of thought does not announce its arrival, it simply becomes the water. The most persistent misconception about the mind is that it is essentially unchanged across history, that Homer thought about the same things we think about, just with fewer words. That is almost certainly false. The classicist Bruno Snell spent decades studying ancient Greek texts, not their content, but their cognitive assumptions. What he found was disturbing. The characters in the Iliad do not deliberate the way modern readers do. Achilles doesn't decide to go to war in the way we understand decision-making. He is acted upon. The gods move through him. The boundary between self and external force is genuinely blurred, not as a literary device, but as a description of how those minds experienced agency. Snell argued, controversially, that the unified, reflective self is not a human constant. It is a cultural invention. Julian Jaynes, a Princeton psychologist, went further. His 1976 book proposed that as late as 1000 BC, human beings were not fully conscious in the modern sense. That what we now call inner thought was experienced as external voice, literally heard, not internally generated. The theory remains debated, but the question it raises does not go away. If the experience of selfhood can change, what else about the mind is not fixed? What feels like natural thought, the spontaneous flow of association, the sense of unified self, is partly an artifact, shaped by the technologies and institutions and languages that surrounded its formation. In the 1930s, the Soviet psychologist Alexander Luria traveled to remote villages in Uzbekistan. He was studying people who had never attended formal school, who could not read, who reasoned through entirely oral, practical knowledge. He showed them a syllogism, the classic form. All bears in the north are white. I live in the north. What color are my bears? The literate response is immediate and logical. But Luria's subjects refused the premise. They said, I've never been to the north. I can only tell you about what I've seen. They weren't wrong. They were operating under a different epistemological contract, one based entirely on direct experience rather than abstract categories. Luria documented something that neuroscience would later support. Literacy doesn't just add knowledge, it restructures the brain. It develops a specific capacity for context-independent reasoning, the ability to think about things you have never encountered. The psychologist Walter Ong called this secondary reality, the mental world that exists before writing, not inferior, different, built on memory, rhythm, formula, repetition. And when writing arrived, the mind that had relied on memory for everything was slowly freed from that burden. When the load of memory was reduced, something else expanded: abstract thought, individual interpretation, the distance between the self and its inherited traditions, the capacity for doubt. Francis Bacon noticed something in 1620 that most people around him could not articulate. He had watched the printing press transform Europe over 150 years, and he understood, before the vocabulary existed to say it clearly, that the technology of information changes the structure of knowledge itself. In the Novum Organum, he cataloged what he called idols, systematic distortions built into the way humans think, not individual errors, structural ones, built into language, built into tribalism, built into the limitations of the senses. He was describing cognitive bias before cognitive psychology existed. Across that same century, René Descartes sat alone in a room and attempted something no philosopher had quite done before: to doubt everything he believed until he reached something he could not doubt. The effort itself was a product of the age. Literacy had made private thought possible. Printing had made individual interpretation respectable. The cogito was not just a philosophical argument. It was a symptom, evidence that the center of gravity had shifted from the community to the individual mind. And a century before either of them, a German goldsmith had set the machine in motion. Gutenberg never appeared to understand what he had done. His interest was commercial: cheaper Bibles, faster production. He did not anticipate that he was about to decentralize the interpretation of those Bibles, collapse the church's monopoly on meaning, and plant the conditions for the scientific revolution, the Reformation, and the modern individual self. The tools of thought do not announce their consequences. They simply arrive. Every time the architecture of thought shifts, something is lost, not only gained. Plato was suspicious of writing. He put the argument in Socrates' mouth. In the Phaedrus, a dialogue about memory, writing, Socrates says, will produce the appearance of wisdom without the substance. For 2,000 years, scholars read this as a quaint worry, a philosopher anxious about new technology. But Plato was pointing at something real. Oral cultures develop a form of memory that is close to encyclopedic, the kind that Homer required, the kind that sustained entire civilizations without a single written word. Writing did reduce that capacity. The mind outsourced what it had previously had to carry internally. When the load of memory was reduced, something else expanded. But the old skill, that encyclopedic, embodied recall, became rare, and then exotic, and then incomprehensible. The neuroscientist Marianne Wolf, in her work on the reading brain, has documented something similar happening now. Digital reading, fast, fragmented, hyperlinked, is associated with reduced capacity for deep reading. Not because people are less intelligent, because the architecture is being retrained by the environment it inhabits most. This is not a moral judgment. It is a description of how minds work. Each cognitive revolution expands something and contracts something else. The capacity gained is visible. The capacity loss is usually only noticed generations later, when the old skill has become rare enough to seem exotic. We are not outside this process. We are inside it, right now. What does it mean that the way humans think has changed before and is almost certainly changing now? It means the mind is not a fixed object. It is a relationship between biology, which changes slowly, and culture, which changes fast, and the tools that culture creates to think with. Marcus Aurelius, who trained his thinking with daily written exercises, his meditations were never meant to be published, only used, understood something about this. He was not being motivational. He was making a clinical observation about the only domain where training was possible. The mind does not change by wishing. It changes by what it repeatedly does. The history of human cognition is not a story of progress from primitive to advanced. It is a story of different kinds of minds, each shaped by what its world asked of it. The Uzbek villager who had only testified to what he had seen was not cognitively limited. He was operating under a different contract with reality, one that had never asked him to reason about bears he could not observe. What kind of mind is being built right now, in this moment, by these tools, these rhythms, these demands on attention, is a question that will be answered by people who are not yet born. They will look back, the way we look at the Uzbek villages or at Homer's heroes, and see a mind shaped by forces it could barely name. Inner observer. Observe your mind. Understand reality.